ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the State of Offshore Wind in Virginia webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Lillian Anderson, and I'm the Director of Energy Programs at Virginia Conservation Network. Virginia Conservation Network is the partnership of the broader environmental community in Virginia. Our network is comprised of over 150 environmental organizations whose work spans advocacy for clean water and land conservation, to land use and transportation, to climate and clean energy. And today we'll be joined by Julia Pendleton and Carly Lohan from the Southeastern Wind Coalition, who will be walking us through what they see as the state of the offshore wind industry in Virginia. Julia is the managing director of the Southeastern Wind Coalition, where she directs programmatic work across 11 states to highlight the economic benefits the wind energy industry can bring to the Southeast. And Carly is the Senior Carolinas Program Manager of the Southeastern Wind Coalition, where she leads SCWC's work to reduce barriers for offshore wind development in North Carolina through grassroots and grasstop outreach. Julia, could you take us to the next slide, please? Thank you. So during today's webinar, the Southeastern Wind Coalition will give us context for what the offshore wind project pipeline looks like across the country, and then dive into specifics on the state of play in Virginia and what the outlook may be ahead. We'll have a little time at the end for questions, and if we do not get to everyone's questions today, we will share our contact information at the end, so you can feel free to reach out to us directly. Please put your questions into the Zoom Q&A box as they arise. Next slide, please. And before I hand it over to Carly and Julia, I wanted to take a moment to thank our partners on this educational webinar: Chesapeake Climate Action Network, National Wildlife Federation, Virginia chapter of the Sierra Club, Virginia League of Conservation Voters, and Oceanic. So thank you all so much. And with that, Carly, I will hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lillian. And just checking in to make sure everybody can hear me okay. Wonderful. Okay. So as Lillian mentioned, my name is Carly Lohan. I am the Senior Carolinas Program Manager for the Southeastern Wind Coalition, but I am starting to step into some more of our Virginia work. So looking forward to getting to know the faces and the organizations that we have on the webinar today. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Southeastern Wind Coalition, we're a 501c3 nonprofit that has a regional footprint across the Southeast, and we focus on advancing offshore and land-based wind in ways that benefit residents, utilities, and industry of the Southeast. So we very much take an objective and data-driven approach and an economic development focus to make sure that the Southeast can take advantage of wind in the best way possible. Next slide, please, Julia. So I'm going to start off by talking about the big picture, set the stage a little bit for offshore wind on the national scale. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So just setting the stage here, I won't go into too much detail because Julia is going to talk about what wind means for Virginia a little bit later on in the presentation, but I did want to take a moment to point out that wind is really one of the best tools that we have to meet our grid and load forecast needs, our reliability needs across the United States and specifically in the Southeast. It also has the ability to generate utility scale, gigawatt scale clean energy. It's something that's deployable and ready for our use in the United States. So it's very important to meeting all of our growing carbon reduction and energy demand needs. And we'll also talk a lot about the economic opportunities associated with the offshore wind industry and specifically the jobs and economic impact that we're seeing in the Commonwealth of Virginia already. So just a quick snapshot of the U.S. project pipeline. We do have 3 projects operating in U.S. waters: Block Island, CVOWS, Pilot turbines, and South Fork Wind, and we've got 4 projects under construction. I know there are a lot of questions related to the status of those projects, and we'll get into that a little bit later as we talk about what's going on and kind of what the future is for offshore wind in the U.S. and in Virginia more specifically. And we've got 31 projects under development. And Julia, if you'll go to the next slide, the reason we point this out is because offshore wind has the potential to drive significant economic development by offering high-paying jobs and improved national security, but it also plays a huge role in advancing our state's decarbonization goals. And I think it's really important to point out that many states are trying to decarbonize at the same time they're also retiring aging fossil fuel infrastructure, and also while they're dealing with increased population growth, new industry manufacturing coming to their states. So this is again all the more reason why it's super important to talk about offshore wind and the scale of clean energy that it can produce for us in Virginia. Just to quickly talk about the Biden administration's offshore wind policies and just to provide some context as where we are today, it's important to understand the federal government's role in offshore wind development. So during his term, the Biden administration advanced key policies that were very significant in giving the nascent offshore wind industry in the United States the support it needed to get off the ground. So the Inflation Reduction Act, the 30 by 30 goal, and the IIJA are just a few examples of some of the key policy measures that help to push the industry forward and get it to where it is today. Additionally, under the Biden administration, BOEM increased its leasing of federal waters for offshore wind development. It approved 11 projects, which together would have brought 19 gigawatts of new clean energy generation to American homes and businesses. So again, it's very important to point out that even the projects that are still in the pipeline are very much creating real jobs and having real economic impact. So the role of the federal government here is very important to talk about. And to get a little bit into the federal permitting and oversight process for offshore wind, I wanted to point out that BOEM's renewable energy program, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, is within the Department of the Interior. It occurs in 4 phases, and while BOEM is not necessarily responsible for issuing the independent or individual permits related for offshore wind, it kind of helps keep everybody organized, in compliance, and on track. So the 4 phases are planning, site assessment, planning, leasing, site assessment, and construction and operation. And throughout this process, BOEM very much engages with stakeholders and ensures that there's early communication with all the interested and affected ocean users or parties. And that's incredibly important to managing potential conflicts, minimizing, mitigating impacts along the way. And Julia, if you'll advance to the next slide, this is just kind of a linear demonstration or illustration of BOEM's leasing process that I just mentioned. And to add a little bit of context for Dominion's Coastal Virginia offshore wind commercial project, Dominion won that lease in 2013. So when it comes online next year in 2026, that project would have been in development for 13 years. And again, just trying to point out here the complexity of the process, the data collection and research and community engagement and all of the very comprehensive steps that happen in this process. Offshore wind is one of the most regulated industries, specifically when it comes to energy. So just kind of wanted to show that due diligence is very much part of the process when it comes to offshore wind. So I will go ahead and pause here and pass it off to Julia.
Thank you, Carly. All right, let's zoom in on Virginia. So first, I think it's important to just establish why the Commonwealth has become a hub for this nascent industry in the US. Offshore wind just kind of makes sense in Virginia for a few key reasons. We do have excellent wind resources in the outer continental shelf in the Central Atlantic. We have a central location on the East Coast with load centers and multiple points of interconnection where the energy from these projects would come onshore. A deep harbor, a great educational system, and a skilled workforce, and established industry that can help to serve the offshore wind sector. And I don't want to make Carly and my other North Carolina colleagues feel badly, but we are the #1 state for business. North Carolina is #2. So, those are some of the favorable conditions that mean that offshore wind in Virginia are a really good fit. And in fully kind of leveraging those benefits that we have, Virginia has supported offshore wind in policy and resource planning, as well as through citizens themselves. So in 2020, the Virginia Clean Economy Act established an offshore wind goal for Virginia, which is 5.2 gigawatts by 2035. So you have that very clear signal established in legislation that communicates, our commitment as a state to building up this industry. As anybody who knows about Virginia's energy landscape understands, we have rising energy demands that we need to meet. As Carly mentioned, offshore wind is a deployable gigawatt scale resource that can help to meet those needs. So in Dominion Energy's most recent IRP in 2024, they called for 6 gigawatts of offshore wind to be developed before 2039. So shortly we'll run through the projects that will contribute to that target. But in addition, Virginia residents have really consistently shown that they support this industry, the job opportunities that it brings, the addition of clean energy to our generation mix. And that has been borne out in polling that remains really consistent over the years. You can see here, we added the results from recent polling that was done in mid to late January of this year, showing that a majority of Virginians support offshore wind, including 53% of Republicans. So let's take a look at the Central Atlantic as a whole. As you can see, there are 4 very large wind energy areas and then a small CVOW pilot project. So the 4 large projects are all under development within this region. CVOW East and CVOW South were acquired by Dominion last year. They're in earlier stages of development. The CVOW commercial project is under construction right now. That CVOW sort of family of projects totals around 6 gigawatts of onshore energy, aligns with Dominion's projections in the IRP, which is enough to power around 1.5 million Virginian homes. The Kitty Hawk project, closer to North Carolina, would bring that total capacity above 8 gigawatts. Obviously, you can see that it's much further south, so there's kind of an open question about whether that energy from Kitty Hawk would maybe feed into Virginia or North Carolina, who the ultimate buyer of that energy might be. But that project is not leased to Dominion. It is owned by Avangrid, which is a developer that has other projects in the Northeast. They actually sold their lease of what was called Kitty Hawk North and is now Kitty Hawk South to Dominion last year. So that allowed Dominion to really acquire those lease areas that they have that total 6 gigawatts. The CVOW pilot project is just 2 turbines. They were constructed in 2020 as a way for Dominion to kind of learn more about developing offshore wind. These were actually the first turbines in US federal waters. So Virginia made history there, and we'll make it again with the CVOW commercial project, which I will dive into now. So when complete, CVOW will be the largest project in the country at 2.6 gigawatts. It's halfway done and has received all of its local, state, and federal permits and approvals to move forward and complete that construction. The overall project cost is more than $10 billion. Offshore wind projects come with this really high upfront capital investment, obviously to develop and construct them. However, once they're online, the only costs are those kind of associated with the ongoing operations and maintenance. So there's no underlying fuel charges that are vulnerable to sort of global market fluctuations or anything like that. So over the 30-year life of the project, you have really stable, predictable costs, which of course really help with that long-term resource planning. We also wanted to just highlight the economic impact that this industry can have and is having for Virginia. So these figures come from a study commissioned by the Hampton Roads Alliance in 2020. You can see here just the incredibly significant amount of investment per gigawatt. So if we develop even 6 of those 8 gigawatts, sort of just from the CVOW projects alone, you can see how much of an economic boost that is going to be, not only for the Hampton Roads region where these projects are staged and many of the jobs are being realized, but also, across the entire Commonwealth. So over the long term, this is an industry that has the potential to be a really incredibly significant part of Virginia's economic future. So I will send it back to Carly to speak a little bit to where things stand now.
Awesome. Thank you, Julia. So we did want to just provide a quick little update on CVAL's construction progress. As Julia mentioned, we are about 50% done, which is incredibly exciting. 78 of the 176 monopile foundations have been installed, and there's been ongoing installation of the transition pieces, but there is a limited construction season specifically for pile driving and anything that makes noise. In order to be mindful of migratory species, specifically whales. So that pile driving will resume in May. We'll continue to see transition piece installation, and there will be a couple vessels installing deep water cables and nearshore cables. And we'll continue to see some of those large components like monopiles and transition pieces arrive at Virginia ports. So if you look at the photos on the right, the one on the top left that just shows that big piece of yellow steel sticking out of the water, that's an example of a monopile. So those will continue to be installed in May. On the top right is actually one of the 3 offshore wind substations that have already been installed. These are huge pieces of infrastructure and really an amazing engineering feat. So there's 2 more of those that are making their way to Portsmouth Marine Terminal. And then if you look on the bottom, that's one of the installation vessels, and those are all those transition piece components that will continue to be installed over the next couple months. And if you want to get more information about those construction updates, Dominion does a really great job of providing all those updates in the Mariner update section of their news section of their website. We wanted to also quickly talk about the environmental stewardship that goes along with the construction and operation of offshore wind projects, and specifically coastal Virginia offshore wind. If you're not already familiar with the construction and operation plan, it's essentially the plan that is approved by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management that lays out all of the steps and protocols and procedures for construction, operation, and maintenance of any given offshore wind project. And there are specific conditions that need to be met that essentially need to make sure that the project is being conducted in a manner that conforms to responsible offshore wind development, uses the application of best management practices that are reviewed on an ongoing basis by BOEM, and ensures that best available science is being used in every way possible. So these procedures stand true for the construction of the pilot turbines that are already in the water and the rest of the coastal Virginia offshore wind commercial project that is being constructed as we speak. So just a few of the examples are the data collection that happens pre-construction, and also the ongoing monitoring that happens through long-term passive acoustic monitoring. There's very comprehensive avian and bat data collection. And I think what's really important to point out here is the ongoing data collection informs best management practices over time. So you may see changes in how coastal Virginia offshore wind is monitoring bats, or the type of technologies that they're using to make sure that birds are not making nests on the wind turbines or things like that. So this is kind of very intentionally an ever-evolving process. Some of the examples of best available science to help minimize impacts are the limitation of construction seasons to make sure that we're not getting in the way of migratory species like whales. There's also voluntary vessel speed restrictions to make sure that there's a reduction of vessel strikes when it comes to whales or turtles or anything else that may be passing through the construction area. Horizontal drilling to make sure there's minimal disruption to the seafloor. One of, I think, the coolest things about offshore wind construction is protected species observers. Depending on the size of the vessel and the size of the project or what's going on at any given moment, there could be 1 or 3 or 5 of these people on a vessel, but essentially they use really cool software and really cool technology to keep an eye out for any marine mammal or marine species that's entering the construction zone, and they actually stop work if they do find that there's a whale in the vicinity. And there's also lots of protective technologies like bubble curtains that are used or perching deterrent devices. So again, all this information is very much publicly available on the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind website, but um, this is just a few of the examples of the conditions that are being undertaken by Dominion during construction.
Thanks, Carly. So to close out, what else is kind of going on right now? I have a prize for the person that can correctly pronounce the word at the top of this slide. Um, it is Charybdis. It's one thing to pronounce, it's another thing to spell it correctly. Uh, but Charybdis is a ship that Dominion is having built right now down in Brownsville, Texas. It's going to be the country's first ever wind turbine installation vessel, WTIV, that is currently doing sea trials in the Gulf, and around kind of early midsummer is going to make its way up to Hampton Roads to start doing the turbine installation for Seabow. So as you can see, it's a really significant investment on Dominion's part. And what's interesting about Charybdis is that once it's finished with the Seabow project, the plan is to kind of lease it to other projects all over the world. So Charybdis is going to go on lots of exciting journeys that will be fun to follow along. Another development that we wanted to highlight was the Alice Greenlink, which is a South Korean company that is opening a subsea cable manufacturing facility in Chesapeake. They're actually breaking ground on this project on Monday. It will bring more than 300 new jobs to the area. It's just such a good example of the benefits of building out the domestic supply chain associated with the offshore wind industry, serving the projects by manufacturing components and obviously bringing new economic opportunities to the communities where they're operating. So we're really excited to see Alice Greenlink kind of establish this facility in Chesapeake. So that's where things stand right now. While I don't have a crystal ball, let's take a look ahead. Carly kind of provided that brief overview of the Biden administration's policies on offshore wind. And I suspect that many of you are here today to kind of understand the Trump administration's position on this industry and what it means for offshore wind in Virginia. So where we stand at the federal level is that on his first day in office, President Trump issued a memorandum, sort of similar to an executive order, pausing that BOEM permitting and leasing process. So in addition to no new leases for offshore wind being granted, any projects that we're hoping to kind of run through the process we spoke to earlier, do those environmental impact statements, the site assessments, construction operations plans, have all that reviewed by BOEM and signed off on, all of that activity has stopped. The memo also ordered a review of existing permits and records of decision that had been granted by BOEM, which is a category that includes the Seabow commercial project. In the last 2 months, 2 projects in the Northeast have been halted, Atlantic Shores and New Jersey and Empire Wind in New York. Those are projects that had received full approval similar to Seabow. And so to speak on the specific conditions around those projects briefly, for Atlantic Shores, this is a project that was originally a joint venture between Shell and EDF Renewables. An opposition group filed a petition for a review of a Clean Air Act permit that was granted by the EPA. The motion was filed requesting the Environmental Appeals Board to return the permit to the agency so that it could be evaluated as part of that review required by President Trump's memorandum on January 20th. So it's a complicated process, but I call it out because the involvement of those more local opposition groups is an interesting factor, and perhaps one that is more unique to New Jersey, where there has been much more robust, sustained, kind of organized local protest against the projects that were proposed there. But unlike the Atlantic Shores project, Empire Wind in New York had begun onshore construction and was preparing to begin offshore work on May 1st. But last week, Doug Burgum, the Secretary of the Interior, halted that project until BOEM is able to review some materials that may suggest that the Biden administration had rushed permit approvals for that, for Empire Wind. To give you some context, that project was projected to create more than 1,500 jobs and provide power to around 500,000 homes in New York. So we can't necessarily speak to what the developers of these projects are going to do in response to these actions, but certainly appealing these decisions and taking legal action is an option that is available to them. So obviously that is kind of shocking for the industry. I will say that for the developers that had those sort of early stage projects, some of these actions from the Trump administration were somewhat anticipated. These are really long lead time projects, energy anyway. So for those early stage projects, maybe the best case scenario is that they are looking at a 4-year delay. But whether a project has been approved or not, from the perspective of the broader industry, these challenges are really significant. They create a lot of uncertainty. They risk thousands of jobs across the country and 25 billion in investment that the offshore wind industry is expected to bring to the US. And they also risk our ability to, meet that rising energy demand and maintain reliability in our electric grid. So kind of given these challenges at the federal level, especially the work stoppages of other fully permitted projects, the primary concern that the Virginian offshore wind industry has right now is completing CVOW. The fact that it's halfway done and $6 billion has already been spent on it maybe puts it in a slightly better position than those other projects. The risk is obviously still there, the risk of a work stoppage. But from a Virginian perspective, not only to have already spent that amount of money, but to have done all of this work over decades to build this industry, to pass legislation, to build that bipartisan support, to negotiate consumer protections, to include diverse stakeholder perspectives, to generate and maintain that consistent constituent support that we see in the polling, to hire and train the people that work on this project. The risk that CVOW could be halted and Virginians might not see 1 kilowatt hour of energy from the project, it would just obviously be really incredibly damaging for the Commonwealth, to put it mildly. So if there isn't direct action from the Trump administration that impacts CVOW, there is a legal challenge that has been going on for more than a year now. It is a lawsuit from a coalition of conservative interest groups, including the Heartland Institute. They argue that Dominion and the federal agencies that approved CVOW were negligent in assessing the project's impacts to endangered right whales. Last year, a judge denied the plaintiff's initial request to halt construction, but that suit is currently in the federal court system. On Wednesday, the Department of Justice, the plaintiffs, and Dominion filed a motion for a 60-day extension to these proceedings, with the reasoning being that those agencies named in the lawsuit, BOEM and the National Marine Fisheries Service, are under new leadership and they need time to kind of organize and become more familiar with the case. With this is concerning to the broader industry that is kind of watching these things unfold. Given the position of the leadership of those agencies at this point, there is a real worry that, unlike what the Biden administration had done under Trump, the federal government may choose to not defend itself and those agencies in this lawsuit. So we will know more when that legal action proceeds, 60 days from Wednesday. It is also worth noting, like Harley mentioned, there is an extraordinarily thorough environmental review as part of permitting CVOW, and the overwhelming sort of scientific consensus is that offshore wind projects do not adversely impact marine life. There's also more fun at the federal level with some uncertainty around the production and investment tax credits that are very common for wind energy projects in the US. So the Inflation Reduction Act established tax incentives for offshore wind, and those are being negotiated as part of current budget reconciliation process in Congress. So there's an open question about whether or not they will remain in place. There's also a bill that was introduced specifically to rescind the president's those offshore wind tax credits. You can see here HR 1462. Whether or not that bill goes anywhere, you can sort of see that President Trump's sentiment around offshore wind is kind of trickling through the agencies that work on offshore wind and some members of Congress who perhaps share that same perspective on this technology. So there are things that we're watching as negotiations move forward in DC. But bringing it back to Virginia, what does this all mean for our broader pipeline? The CVAL East and CVAL South projects remain in Dominion's long-term plans, as I mentioned. I would say that the date that was in the 2024 IRP of 2039 is more likely given the pause of permitting at the federal level. So it's obviously very uncertain, but it is a reasonable expectation to say that those projects will be developed if and when the policies around permitting change, whether that's under the Trump administration or a future administration. But right now, Dominion is focused on the successful completion of CVAL. For Kitty Hawk, the project that's further south and closer to North Carolina, that is the lease that is not held by Dominion. Avangrid is continuing the work that they can on that wind energy area, obviously understanding that they're not going to move through that federal permitting process. But they're working on finding buyers for that energy, determining points of interconnect and other sort of technical elements with that development, and working with Duke and the state of North Carolina and responding to an RFI. All right, we have one last slide and I don't want to end on a downer. So I'm going to give you a little something that maybe is some good news, things to keep in mind. So if completed, CVAL will be such a good success story for offshore wind in the US and for Virginia. Thousands of jobs created and hundreds of millions of dollars in economic activity. We're going to see the power come online. We're going to be able to tell that story about what offshore wind actually looks like in practice. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity for us as Virginians to own this project and be really proud of it, and be able to tell its story. Another key benefit that Virginia has is there's bipartisan support for wind here, and that remains really robust. We have champions at the state and federal levels. I've included a quote here from Congresswoman Jen Higgins, who testified earlier this year before Congress regarding those tax credits for offshore wind, and basically saying, she has seen firsthand the benefit that this industry is bringing to her district, and just being a really public champion for the continuation of those tax incentives to support the industry. So it's obviously really great to see that we have champions on both sides of the aisle for this issue. For any of you who are local to the Virginia Beach area, I'll leave you with a plug for the IPF conference that is going on next week. It is the International Partnering Forum that is held by Oceantic Network. They're an organization that works to advance offshore renewable energy around the world. So IPF kind of brings this global offshore wind industry together every year. 2025, it's being hosted by Virginia Beach and sponsored by Dominion. So if you live in Virginia Beach and you happen to see suddenly there's a lot of sort of Norwegians and Germans and Danes around the city, you'll know they're there for IPF. But offshore wind is a really global industry, and so events like IPF really reinforce that America doesn't want to be left out, or or kind of lose out. So huge thank you to Oceanic Network for hosting that event every year. It's going to be really good, and I'll probably see some of you there next week.